August 1945. World War II was nearing its end, yet Japan still refused to surrender. The United States faced a choice: a bloody invasion or a secret weapon just created. August 6th, Hiroshima. August 9th, Nagasaki. Two blinding flashes tore open the sky. Two cities turned into hell. Over 200,000 lives ended within days. It was not only the end of the war, but the beginning of the nuclear age, of a global fear. And the haunting question that lingers to this day: was it truly necessary to drop those two bombs? World War II entered 1945 with the balance clearly tilted in favor of the Allies. In Europe, Nazi Germany had already surrendered in May, but in the Pacific, Japan continued to resist despite its desperate situation. The bloody battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa earlier that year revealed the Japanese Army's determination to fight to the death. At Okinawa alone, U.S. forces suffered around 72,000 casualties, while Japan lost more than 100,000 soldiers along with tens of thousands of civilians. Faced with the prospect of launching a direct invasion of the Japanese home islands, Operation Downfall, American leaders estimated that casualties on both sides could reach into the millions. President Harry S. Truman was forced to find a way to make Japan surrender quickly, avoiding a bloody invasion while also keeping the element of retribution for Pearl Harbor. At that moment, the United States held a secret weapon, the atomic bomb, the result of the Manhattan Project, launched in 1942 with cooperation from Britain and Canada. Thousands of leading scientists, including Robert Oppenheimer, had poured their efforts into the project. On July 16, 1945, in the New Mexico desert, the world's first atomic bomb was tested under the code name Trinity. The explosion produced a massive fireball and a mushroom cloud tens of thousands of meters high, marking the dawn of the nuclear age. News of the test was immediately relayed to Truman while he was attending the Potsdam Conference with Allied leaders. Soon after, the U.S., Britain, and China issued the Potsdam Declaration, demanding Japan's unconditional surrender under threat of utter destruction. But Tokyo ignored the ultimatum, as its leadership remained divided. The civilian side sought negotiations that would preserve the emperor's role, while the military insisted on fighting to the bitter end in hopes of a decisive battle that might shift the balance. In this situation, Truman made one of the most controversial decisions of the 20th century: to use the atomic bomb. An advisory committee led by Secretary of War Henry L. Stimson held multiple meetings to weigh the options. Some argued for a demonstration explosion in an uninhabited area to warn Japan, but most feared that if the show of force failed to compel surrender, the U.S. would lose the element of shock. In the end, the committee agreed. The target had to be a city significant enough to shock both the government and the public, forcing unconditional surrender. The list of potential targets included Kyoto, Hiroshima, Yokohama, and Kokura. Although Kyoto initially ranked high due to its symbolic importance, Stimson insisted on removing it because of its cultural value, replacing it with Nagasaki. The final list consisted of Hiroshima, Kokura, Nagasaki, and Niigata. On July 25, 1945, Truman officially ordered General Carl A. Spaatz, commander of U.S. Strategic Air Forces in the Pacific, to prepare to drop the atomic bomb on one of the four targets immediately after August 3rd, weather permitting. Two bombs were ready. Little Boy, fueled by uranium-235, intended for Hiroshima, and Fat Man, using plutonium-239, aimed at Kokura with Nagasaki as a backup target. Everything had already been moved to the Tinian Air Base in the Pacific. By early August 1945, the U.S. military was fully prepared to unleash the first nuclear attack in human history, a strike that would not only end the war, but also reshape the global order for decades to come. Hiroshima, an important industrial port city in the southwest of Honshu, had about 350,000 residents in 1945. Unlike many other Japanese cities that had already been ravaged by American bombing raids in the final months of the war, Hiroshima remained almost completely intact. This led to speculation among its residents. Some believed the city was being saved to serve as an American headquarters after the war. Others thought it was spared because many people in Hiroshima had relatives living in the U.S. The truth was far harsher. Precisely because it was untouched, Hiroshima was chosen to demonstrate the pure destructive power of the new weapon, the atomic bomb. In the early hours of August 6, 1945, the mission began. At 2:45 a.m. from Tinian Air Base, the B-29 bomber Enola Gay, commanded by Colonel Paul Tibbets, took off carrying Little Boy, the world's first atomic bomb to be used in war. Two other B-29s flew alongside, the great artiste with measuring instruments and necessary evil assigned to take photographs. Hours earlier, weather reconnaissance planes had scouted Hiroshima and the backup targets of Kokura and Nagasaki. At around 5:55 a.m., the planes regrouped over Iwo Jima as planned before heading toward Japan. During the flight, Major William Parsons, the mission's technical officer, assembled and armed the bomb inside the aircraft. He knew the risk. A single accident on takeoff could have obliterated Tinian itself. Only once the bomber had reached a safe altitude did he insert the detonator, putting Little Boy into a ready state. By 7:30 a.m., the formation entered Japanese airspace. In Hiroshima, air raid sirens had sounded earlier when radar detected a few American planes nearby, but seeing only a handful, authorities dismissed them as reconnaissance. At 7:09 a.m., loudspeakers announced that the danger had passed. Citizens left their shelters, children returned to school, and workers resumed their shifts. The city regained the calm of a summer morning, the last moments of peace it would ever know. At exactly 8:15 a.m., Enola Gay released its payload. From nearly 31,000 feet, Little Boy fell for 44 seconds before detonating at an altitude of 580 meters above the city center. A blinding flash brighter than the sun erupted, followed by a massive fireball reaching millions of degrees. With the force of 16,000 tons of TNT, the explosion unleashed an intense flash, a devastating shockwave, and a searing blast of heat that consumed everything for miles. The intended target was the Ayoi Bridge, easily recognizable from the air due to its T-shape. But crosswinds pushed the bomb about 240 meters off, causing it to explode above the Shima Hospital. Within moments, everything within a 1.6-kilometer radius was obliterated, and vast swaths of the city burst into flames. In the sky, Enola Gay banked sharply to escape. Less than a minute later, the shockwave caught up with the aircraft, shaking the 30-ton bomber violently. Tibbets and his crew turned to witness the spectacle behind them, a giant mushroom cloud rising furiously, engulfing the sky. "The light was brighter than the sun," one crew member murmured, while Parsons muttered, "What just happened was both terrifying and awe-inspiring." Another officer could only whisper, "My God." Hiroshima, a city that minutes before had been alive with ordinary summer routines, had vanished beneath a sea of fire and black smoke. Beneath the blast, the people of Hiroshima endured a morning of horror unlike anything the world had ever seen. When the bomb detonated, many recalled seeing a blinding bluish-white flash, the pika, or lightning flash, as the Japanese called it, before being thrown to the ground by the crushing roar, the dawn. Within a radius of just 1 to 2 kilometers from the hypocenter, the unimaginable heat, soaring to 4,000 degrees Celsius, incinerated human bodies instantly. Tens of thousands of men, women, and children were vaporized or reduced to charred remains in an instant. Further out, countless others were hurled through the air by the shockwave. Houses collapsed, glass shattered into lethal shards. Almost immediately, thousands of small fires, sparked by broken gas lines, stoves, and electrical wires, merged into an immense firestorm that swept through the city, with winds so fierce they carried victims into the rivers. Within an hour, Hiroshima had become a living hell, streets engulfed in flames, buildings erased from existence, the dead and dying scattered everywhere. Survivors wandered dazed through the ashes, unable to recognize the familiar streets of their hometown. The anguished cries of those trapped under rubble or writhing in agony from burns echoed across the ruins. Yoshito Matsushige, the only photographer to capture images in Hiroshima that day, later wrote, "The sight was truly horrific. It was like a piece of hell on earth." By evening on August 6th, the flames had begun to die down. The city was almost completely erased. About 69% of all structures were destroyed and another 6 to 7% heavily damaged. Only the most robust reinforced concrete frames remained standing, among them the Industrial Promotion Hall directly beneath the blast. Everyone inside perished, yet the building's skeletal dome endured, a silent witness to the tragedy. Today, those ruins stand as the Hiroshima Peace Memorial, or Genbaku Dome, preserved as a UNESCO World Heritage Site since 1996. The human toll is nearly impossible to calculate. It is estimated that 70,000 to 80,000 people were killed instantly by the blast and ensuing fires. In the days and months that followed, tens of thousands more succumbed to grievous injuries, burns, and a mysterious sickness not yet understood, later identified as radiation poisoning. Many who had seemed unharmed collapsed days later, their hair falling out, suffering vomiting, bleeding, weakness, and death. With Hiroshima's hospitals and infrastructure obliterated, medical relief was almost non-existent. By the end of 1945, the death toll in Hiroshima was estimated at around 140,000, nearly half the city's pre-war population. The most chilling fact was that over 90% of the victims were civilians, including vast numbers of women, children, and the elderly. Around 20 Allied prisoners of war, American, British, and Dutch, held near the city center, also perished. Hiroshima had become a massive collective grave, the first place on Earth where humankind witnessed the devastation of nuclear warfare. News of the atomic bomb's terrifying power was immediately relayed back to Washington. On the afternoon of August 6, 1945, U.S. time, President Harry S. Truman addressed the nation by radio, announcing briefly that the United States had dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima, a Japanese military base. He warned Japan that if it did not accept the Allies' terms of unconditional surrender at once, it would face a rain of ruin from the air, the like of which has never been seen on this earth. It was a direct threat that America was prepared to keep using atomic bombs until Japan capitulated. At the same time, the U.S. military scattered more than 6 million leaflets over dozens of Japanese cities, explaining that a single atomic bomb carried the destructive power of 2,000 B-29s attacking at once, and urging citizens to pressure the emperor to end the war. Ironically, due to distribution issues, Nagasaki did not receive these warning leaflets until August 10th, after it had already been bombed. In Tokyo, the destruction of Hiroshima shocked the Japanese leadership, but it was still not enough to force immediate surrender. The Supreme War Council, consisting of Prime Minister Suzuki and the heads of the military branches, convened an emergency meeting. Even though the devastation of Hiroshima dwarfed all previous air raids, Japan's generals remained defiant. They still hoped the Soviet Union might mediate, or at least wanted to wait and see if the U.S. had more bombs. The Japanese government quietly insisted on 4 conditions for surrender: preserving the emperor system, kokutai, disarming their own military, avoiding Allied occupation, and trying war criminals domestically. But the Allies had made it clear they would accept nothing short of unconditional surrender, leaving the gap between both sides irreconcilable. Emperor Hirohito hesitated, and Prime Minister Suzuki could not unify his cabinet. Then, before Japan could make its move, came the blow they most feared. The Soviet Union declared war. On the night of August 8, 1945, that fear became reality. At 11 p.m. Moscow time, Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov summoned the Japanese ambassador to announce that the USSR was unilaterally abrogating its neutrality pact. Just hours later, in the early morning of August 9th, Tokyo time, the Red Army launched its massive offensive into Manchuria, with more than 1.5 million troops storming Japanese-occupied Manchuria, Korea, and Sakhalin. It was a strategic death blow. Japan was caught in a vice, America pressing from the east and the Soviets from the north and west, leaving no hope of stalling for favorable terms. Yet inside Tokyo, the military faction still resisted. War Minister Korochika Anami and the Army's high command pushed for martial law across the nation, even preparing to stage a coup if Emperor Hirohito chose to surrender. And in that moment of turmoil, America's second atomic bomb was already on its way toward another Japanese city. The second atomic strike had originally been scheduled for August 11th, giving Japan several days to absorb the shock of Hiroshima. But with forecasts of poor weather starting on August 10th, and with the Soviet Union's sudden entry into the war, the U.S. advanced the mission to August 9th, 1945. The primary target was the industrial city of Kokura on Kyushu Island, with Nagasaki designated as the secondary target if Kokura could not be bombed. The second atomic weapon, nicknamed Fat Man and coded F-31, was fully assembled and assigned to the crew of Captain Charles W. Sweeney, who had piloted the Great Artiste during the Hiroshima mission and now flew the B-29 Boxcar. At 3:47 a.m., Tinian time, Boxcar lifted off carrying Fat Man toward Japan. Escorting the bomber were 2 other planes, Lagan Dragon, sent ahead to scout the weather over Kokura, and Big Stink, carrying cameras and observers, including 2 British officers invited to witness history. This time, Colonel Paul Tibbets of Enola Gay fame did not command, leaving Sweeney with full authority to decide whether or not to drop the bomb depending on conditions. The mission encountered problems even before takeoff. During pre-flight checks, engineers discovered a faulty fuel pump that rendered 7,000 liters of fuel in one tank unusable. This meant the aircraft would have to carry the dead weight of the fuel, but could not access it in flight, a critical handicap. Although the issue could have been fixed or the bomb transferred to another aircraft, either option would have taken hours, and Fat Man was already armed with a highly sensitive detonator. Sweeney chose to risk it, pressing on with limited fuel reserves. After nearly 7 hours in the air, Boxcar reached the rendezvous point off Japan. But Big Stink failed to appear due to a navigation error, forcing Sweeney to circle for 40 minutes, burning precious fuel. Finally, at 8:45 a.m., he abandoned the weight and turned toward Kokura. Reports from Lagan Dragon said the skies were clear, but when Boxcar arrived, the crew found the city shrouded in thick smoke. The day before, U.S. bombing raids on a nearby city had created massive fires whose smoke drifted over Kokura. Japanese factory workers also deliberately set coal fires to thicken the haze. For nearly 50 minutes, Boxcar made 3 passes over Kokura, searching for a clear drop zone, but over 70% of the target was obscured. Heavy anti-aircraft fire from the ground further complicated matters, making a visual drop impossible. With fuel running critically low, Sweeney reluctantly abandoned Kokura. From that incident came the Japanese saying, "Lucky as Kokura," meaning an escape from catastrophe by the narrowest of margins. The formation turned toward the secondary target, Nagasaki, about 150 kilometers away. Nagasaki, a large port city nestled among coastal hills and valleys of Kyushu, had already sounded an air raid alert at 7:50 a.m. when radar picked up approaching aircraft. But at 8:30, the all-clear was given after only 2 reconnaissance planes were sighted. Citizens resumed their routines. Workers headed to factories, children went back to school, and others returned home from shelters. When Boxcar and its companion plane arrived at around 10:55 a.m., Nagasaki's defenses did not respond, likely assuming the small formation was the same reconnaissance flight seen earlier. In fact, Nagasaki had never been included in the U.S. leaflet warning campaign. Its residents were completely unaware of Hiroshima's annihilation just 3 days earlier. At 11 a.m., the skies above Nagasaki were heavy with clouds. Captain Charles Sweeney, commander of the Boxcar, initially intended to release the bomb using radar, a blind drop without visual confirmation, in order to save both time and the last drops of fuel. But Major Charles Alberry, the bombardier, requested a few more minutes in hopes of spotting a break in the cloud cover. Fortune struck at the very last moment. At 11:01, the clouds briefly parted, revealing the Urakami Valley Industrial District in northern Nagasaki. Lieutenant Kermit Behan, the bombardier, shouted that he had the target in sight and released Fat Man from about 9,000 meters. After 47 seconds of free fall, the bomb detonated at 11:02 a.m. on August 9, 1945. Once again, the skies over Japan erupted with the destructive force of nuclear fire. Fat Man, with a plutonium core weighing about 6 kilograms, was more powerful than Little Boy. It exploded at an altitude of 503 meters, directly over a tennis court in the Urakami Valley. The blast unleashed energy equivalent to 21,000 tons of TNT, roughly 30% stronger than Hiroshima. Within a radius of 1.5 kilometers from the hypocenter, factories and homes were obliterated, and northern Nagasaki was flattened. Yet because Nagasaki was surrounded by hills and ridges, the destruction was confined largely to the Urakami Valley, rather than spreading across the whole city as in Hiroshima. The downtown commercial district and port farther away were shielded and suffered less damage. The bomb also missed its intended aiming point, the city's central bridge, by about 3 kilometers. Ironically, it instead exploded almost directly above the Mitsubishi torpedo factory, the very plant that had built the weapons used in the Pearl Harbor attack of 1941. In seconds, the factory and other military-industrial facilities were annihilated. The Urakami Cathedral, then one of the largest Catholic churches in Asia, was leveled, and about 6,000 parishioners nearby perished instantly. The Boxcar crew had little time to observe the destruction. With fuel almost gone, Sweeney turned immediately toward Okinawa, the nearest Allied-held island, for an emergency landing. The bomber touched down at Yantan Airfield running on fumes, 2 engines shut down and nearly skidded off the runway. Unlike Enola Gay, which had been celebrated on its return to Tinian, Boxcar and its weary crew stepped off in silence, greeted by no fanfare. Only later did they realize how close they had come to disaster, mere minutes from being forced to ditch the bomb at sea or crash into the ocean. Meanwhile, Nagasaki was engulfed in catastrophe. Though its population was smaller than Hiroshima's, about 263,000 in 1945, the atomic bomb claimed an estimated 40,000 lives on August 9th alone. By the end of the year, the death toll rose to between 70,000 and 80,000, most of them civilians, including tens of thousands of Mitsubishi workers caught at their jobs that morning. Thanks to the hills around the city, some neighborhoods were shielded and spared complete annihilation. Still, within 1.6 kilometers of the hypocenter, nothing survived. Over half of Mitsubishi's facilities in Nagasaki, steelworks, arms plants, and shipyards were destroyed or heavily damaged. Unlike Hiroshima, where the fires merged into a massive firestorm, Nagasaki's narrow river valley and coastal winds dispersed the flames outward, confining them mainly to the riverfront. But another horror followed. About 20 minutes after the blast, black rain laced with radioactive soot, began to fall, lasting for hours and poisoning many survivors who had initially escaped death. All told, the two atomic bombings killed more than 200,000 Japanese by the end of 1945. Estimates range from 150,000 to 246,000. Roughly half died instantly. The rest succumbed to injuries, burns, and radiation sickness in the months that followed. Hiroshima and Nagasaki, once thriving cities, had been reduced to ashes, leaving behind only devastation and the haunting legacy of the first and only use of nuclear weapons in human history. A chain of devastating events, Hiroshima obliterated on August 6th, the Soviet assault on Manchuria at dawn on August 9th, and Nagasaki, reduced to ruins by noon that same day, pushed Japan to the brink of collapse. On the evening of August 9th, Emperor Hirohito attended an emergency meeting where the military faction still urged resistance, despite admitting the hopelessness of the war. Near midnight, he intervened directly, declaring acceptance of Allied surrender terms with one condition: the preservation of the imperial throne. On August 10th, Japan relayed this stance through Switzerland. The United States replied it would accept if the emperor remained only as a symbolic figure. Hirohito agreed, warning that further war would mean not only national destruction, but also the annihilation of civilization itself. On the night of August 14th, radical officers staged a coup to block the broadcast of the imperial rescript, but it quickly collapsed. At noon on August 15th, for the first time, the Japanese people heard their emperor's voice on the radio. He described the atomic bomb as a weapon of unprecedented cruelty and announced acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration. Though he never used the word surrender, the meaning was unmistakable. The war was over. On September 2nd, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, Japan signed the instrument of surrender before the Allied powers. World War II had officially ended. And with irony, the sole condition Japan had pleaded for, preserving the emperor, was ultimately accepted, leaving a haunting question. Were the two atomic bombs truly necessary? Had that concession been granted earlier? The two atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki left behind humanitarian consequences unprecedented in human history. In just seconds, tens of thousands of lives were erased, most of them civilians, women, children, and the elderly who had never held a weapon. Around 70 to 80,000 people died instantly in Hiroshima and 40 to 50,000 in Nagasaki. Tens of thousands more struggled with burns, injuries, and both physical and mental suffering in the days that followed. Those who survived became hibakusha, bomb-affected people, carrying scars of fire and radiation on their bodies. The intense heat burned grotesque patterns into their skin, sometimes even imprinting kimono fabric designs. Many who initially seemed unharmed later collapsed with strange symptoms: hair falling out in clumps, bleeding, exhaustion, and sudden death. Doctors, with hospitals destroyed and medicine scarce, could do little more than watch their patients fade away, only later understanding it was acute radiation exposure. In the years that followed, radiation's shadow stretched on. Survivors faced high rates of leukemia, thyroid cancer, infertility, miscarriages, and birth defects. Entire families carried the weight of a so-called cursed generation, as children were born weak or deformed. Social stigma worsened the trauma, with hibakusha often shunned out of fear of contagion or genetic damage. Governments and international organizations later provided financial and medical support, but nothing could erase the wounds etched into bodies, families, and memory. Both cities had to rebuild from nothing. Hiroshima became a scorched plain, Nagasaki's Urakami Valley reduced to ash. Yet from the ruins they rose again. Hiroshima was rebuilt with a mission to become a city of peace, preserving the atomic dome as a permanent reminder. Nagasaki built the Atomic Bomb Museum and Peace Park on the very ground zero of Urakami. Each year, on August 6th and 9th, the bells ring at the exact time the bombs fell, and lanterns drift across rivers, carrying prayers for the souls lost. In the immediate aftermath, however, the truth of Hiroshima and Nagasaki was tightly controlled. The U.S. occupation censored reports, confiscated photos and films, and sealed them for years. Foreign journalists were restricted. Only a few, like Australian reporter Wilfred Burchett, managed to expose the world to what he called the atomic plague. At first, U.S. officials denied radiation effects, even publishing articles insisting the bomb left no lasting consequences. But reality was undeniable. Burned children, charred corpses, entire districts wiped clean. By 1946, the U.S. military itself released film of the devastation, a grim warning to any nation tempted to test America's resolve. These images shocked the conscience of the world. As Albert Camus wrote just 2 days after Hiroshima, our mechanical civilization has reached its highest level of barbarism. Humanity must now choose collective suicide or intelligent use of science. This is not a call, but a demand. From Hiroshima's ashes, a global movement for peace and nuclear disarmament took root. The mayors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki later founded the Mayors for Peace Network, joining hundreds of cities worldwide in pledging never again. Yet the debate over the bomb has never ceased. Critics argue it was unnecessary. Japan was already defeated, seeking peace if only the emperor's throne were preserved. The 1946 U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey concluded Japan likely would have surrendered before year's end without atomic bombs, without Soviet entry, and without invasion. Generals like Eisenhower, MacArthur, and Nimitz opposed the bomb, calling it militarily pointless. Supporters counter that the bomb saved millions by ending the war immediately, preventing a bloody invasion of Japan. They argue that only the twin shocks of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, combined with the Soviet attack, forced the emperor to overrule hardliners and accept surrender. The moral weight of the decision remains one of the fiercest debates in modern history. No matter the perspective, Hiroshima and Nagasaki stand as a shared human warning. They showed that nuclear war equals absolute annihilation. To this day, they remain the only cities ever attacked with atomic bombs, and their memory has helped deter their use since. Post-war Japan was transformed, renouncing war in its 1947 constitution, pledging never to possess nuclear weapons, and becoming a global voice for disarmament. Yet scars endure, in the hibakusha, in national memory, in the haunting stories passed to later generations. Today, Hiroshima and Nagasaki are not only thriving cities but living symbols of peace. Tourists stand beneath the atomic dome at sunset, or hear the story of Sadako folding 1,000 paper cranes for a wish of healing. In Nagasaki, the broken-winged angel statue in the Atomic Bomb Museum reminds visitors of what was lost in a single moment. On Memorial Days, lanterns float along the Motoyasu River, lights gliding like prayers for the dead and for a future free of bombs. As Albert Einstein once said, the atomic bomb has changed everything except our way of thinking. Nuclear power remains a double-edged sword, capable of lighting cities or erasing civilizations in an instant. And so, the ultimate legacy of Hiroshima and Nagasaki is this eternal command: choose peace over war, dialogue over destruction, so that the tragedy of 1945 will never be repeated.